Oh my God.
Frank Miller had spent 43 years training horses, buying horses, selling horses, and believing that he understood them better than any person alive. But on the night that changed everything, a horse would teach him something no amount of experience could have prepared him for. What happened in that barn would make a grown man cry for the first time in 30 years. And it would start with a sound so terrible that Frank would spend the rest of his life wondering how he had missed the truth that was screaming at him every single night. By the time you finish reading this story, you will understand why some people say that Frank Miller died that night, and a completely different man woke up when the sun rose. The evening had started like every other evening on the ranch. Frank was 68 years old, and his body moved through the familiar routines without much thought. He was the kind of man who did not believe in wasting time on feelings or reflections. Work was what mattered. Work was honest. Work did not disappoint you the way people did. His wife had left 3 years ago, and Frank had simply accepted it the way he accepted rain or drought. It happened. You dealt with it. You moved forward. That was the rancher's way. The sun dropped behind the western ridge around 5:30 in the evening. It was late autumn, and the sky turned the color of burnt orange mixed with deep purple. The wind was starting to pick up from the north, and Frank could smell the cold coming. He stood outside the barn for a moment, looking out across the 200 acres that made up his ranch. The land stretched out flat and empty under the dying light. There were no neighbors within sight, no one to hear what came next, no one to help. That detail would matter more than Frank could possibly imagine. Frank locked the barn door and walked toward the house. His boots made crunching sounds on the gravel path. His back hurt, his knees hurt. His hands were so stiff from arthritis that some mornings he had trouble opening the coffee can. But these were things that happened to old men. Frank accepted them without complaint. He had built his entire life on the idea that complaining was for weak people, and he was not weak. Inside the house, Frank made himself dinner. Nothing fancy. Some beef, some beans, some bread that he had bought from the store 3 days ago. The kitchen was clean but cold. His wife had liked to keep plants on the windowsill, bright green things that made the space feel alive. Frank had thrown all of them out after she left. They seemed pointless without her there to care for them. He ate his dinner standing up at the counter, reading the ranch newspaper that had arrived in the mail. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Frank turned on the radio just to hear another human voice, even if it was only a radio announcer talking about the weather. The announcer said that a cold front was moving in from Canada. Temperatures would drop below freezing by midnight. Wind gusts could reach 40 miles per hour. It was nothing Frank had not seen before. The radio announcer made it sound dramatic, the way people who lived in cities always made weather sound dramatic. But out here on the ranch, weather was just weather. You prepared for it, and then you went about your business. Frank went to bed around 10 o'clock. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind start to howl outside. The old house creaked and shifted with the gusts. He had lived in this house for 12 years, and it had never once felt like a home. It was just a place where he slept and ate and prepared for the next day's work. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep. Around midnight, the screaming started. It was not a sound that Frank recognized. In 43 years of working with horses, he had heard many sounds. He had heard horses whinny when they were excited. He had heard them neigh when they wanted food. He had heard the harsh sound they made when they were startled or angry. But this sound was different. This was a sound that came from deep inside a creature, a sound that belonged to pain or terror or something worse than both combined. Frank lay in bed for almost 5 minutes before he forced himself to accept that the screaming was not going to stop. It went on, a long, piercing wail that cut through the wind and the cold and the darkness. Every time it seemed like it would fade, it would build again, even louder and more desperate than before. Frank pulled on his jacket and his boots. He was moving slowly now, his body complaining about being forced out of its warm bed into the freezing night. He took his flashlight from the table by the door and walked out into the darkness. The wind immediately hit him like a physical thing, pushing against his chest, cutting at his face. The temperature had already dropped to near freezing, and his breath came out in white clouds. The screaming grew louder as he walked toward the barn. It was definitely coming from the horses. Frank walked faster, his old joints aching with each step. The beam of his flashlight bobbed and jumped across the frozen ground. He could see frost sparkles in the grass, beautiful and dangerous at the same time. When he reached the barn, he pushed open the heavy door. The sound of the screaming was almost unbearable now. It filled the entire space, bouncing off the wooden walls and the metal equipment. The other horses were agitated and nervous. They moved restlessly in their stalls, some of them adding their own worried calls to the chaos. Frank moved deeper into the barn, following the direction of the screaming. It was coming from the back section where he kept the younger horses. His flashlight beam found the animal almost immediately. It was Monarch, a 4-year-old chestnut horse that Frank had raised from a newborn foal. Monarch was one of his favorites, though Frank did not like to admit that he had favorites. The horse was smart and calm, and had never given him a moment of trouble. Now Monarch looked like a completely different animal. The horse was rearing up in his stall, his legs flailing. His eyes were wide and rolling white with terror. Sweat covered his entire body, even though the barn was freezing cold. The horse's breathing was fast and shallow and panicked. When Frank came closer, Monarch screamed again, a sound so raw and filled with fear that Frank actually stepped backward. Frank's mind started working through possibilities.
It could be colic. It could be an infection. It could be that something was stuck in the horse's throat. Frank had seen all of these things before and knew how to handle them. But as he looked at Monarch more carefully, he noticed something strange. The horse was not just panicking from pain. Monarch was staring at something. His neck was stretched toward the corner of the barn, and his entire body was trembling violently. His eyes were locked on something that Frank could not see. Frank turned his flashlight toward that corner. He saw nothing but darkness and the familiar clutter that had accumulated in that space over the years. An old saddle leaning against the wall, stacks of hay bales, a broken water pump that had been sitting there for at least 6 months, a wooden crate that looked like it had been there forever. Frank reached out to touch Monarch's neck, trying to calm him the way he always did when a horse was nervous. But the moment his hand made contact with the horse's skin, Monarch screamed again. The sound was so terrible and so filled with pure terror that Frank stepped back away from the stall. Frank stood there in the freezing barn, watching this horse that he believed he knew better than any creature on earth, and he felt something shift inside him. He did not understand what was happening. All his experience, all his knowledge, all his certainty about horses meant nothing in this moment. He was completely lost. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket near Monarch's stall and waited for the sun to come up. He did not leave the barn. He could not leave. Some part of him, the part that was not yet ready to accept that he did not understand horses the way he thought he did, kept him there in the freezing cold, watching and listening and trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. The screaming stopped around 4 o'clock in the morning. Frank had no watch, but he could tell by the way the wind was changing and the way the darkness seemed to be loosening its grip just a little bit. The silence that followed the screaming was almost worse than the noise itself. At least when Monarch was screaming, Frank felt like he was witnessing something real and urgent. The silence made him feel like he was missing something important, something that the horse was still trying to tell him. Monarch did not calm down completely. The horse paced in his stall, back and forth, his hooves making dull thuds against the wooden floor. Every few minutes, he would stop and stare at that same corner again. His ears would prick forward, and his body would go tense, as if he was listening to something that Frank could not hear. Then he would shake his head and go back to pacing. Frank's joints were screaming by the time the first hints of gray light started creeping across the eastern horizon. His legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket for so many hours. His back felt like it had turned to concrete. He was 68 years old, and he suddenly felt every single one of those years, plus about 20 more. He forced himself to stand up, holding onto the wooden beam of the barn for support while his legs remembered how to work again. The morning was coming slow and cold. The frost that covered the ground outside glittered like broken diamonds in the early light. Frank could see his breath inside the barn now. The air was that cold. But he was not thinking about the cold anymore. He was thinking about Monarch, and he was thinking about all the ways he might have missed something important. Frank approached the horse carefully, the way he would approach an animal he did not know. Monarch's eyes were still wide, and he was still covered in sweat despite the freezing temperature. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained to do, the way he had done thousands of times before. He ran his hands down each of the horse's legs, checking for heat, for swelling, for any sign of injury that would cause this kind of panic. There was nothing. The legs were cool and normal. The hooves looked healthy and clean. There were no cuts or scrapes or signs of infection anywhere that Frank could find. He moved to the horse's sides, feeling carefully for the hardness and tightness that would indicate colic, one of the most serious problems that could happen to a horse. Again, he found nothing wrong. Frank pulled out his veterinary kit from the shelf where he kept it. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic medical supplies close at hand. Out here, far from any vet, you had to be able to handle emergencies yourself. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the horse's mouth. Normal. He checked the horse's heart rate by feeling the pulse in the horse's neck. Maybe slightly elevated, but that was expected if the animal had been in panic for hours. Frank looked at Monarch's eyes more carefully. The pupils looked normal. The horse's breathing, while still rapid, was not struggling. By every objective measure that Frank could use, Monarch was a healthy animal. The horse was not sick. The horse was not injured. Yet something was clearly very, very wrong. Frank stepped back and looked at the stall carefully. He examined the food and water. Both were clean and fresh, nothing unusual there. He looked at the straw bedding, checking for anything that might have scared the horse. Nothing. He looked at the walls and the roof, searching for any sign of damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. Everything seemed perfectly normal. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked the night before. In his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior, he had not really looked at where the horse was staring. The horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn where a wooden crate was sitting. The crate was old and weathered, with boards that had cracked and split over the years. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. It had been on the property when he bought the place 12 years ago, left behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment and junk. Frank walked over to the crate and looked at it more closely in the growing light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered, maybe 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. There were dark stains on one corner, the kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. Frank reached down and tried to move the crate. It was heavier than he expected. In the horse's throat. As he shifted it, Frank had seen all of these things not the smell of old wood knew how to handle them or hay, but as he looked at Monarch more carefully, something organic, he noticed something strange. That had been decomposing. The horse was not just panicking silence for much longer. Monarch was staring at something. Wanted to think about. His neck was stretched toward the corner of the barn. He knew that smell, and his entire body was trembling violently. It was the smell of death. His eyes were locked on something. Frank's hands moved almost without his permission. Frank turned his flashlight, pulling the crate open. Lifting he saw nothing but darkness and the familiar clutter that had accumulated in that space over the years that were stored inside. An old saddle leaning against the wall, buried in the darkness of hay bales, everything else. A broken water fountain that had been sitting there for remains of a small animal. A wooden crate that looked like it had been there forever. Through his mouth. Frank reached out to touch Monarch's neck. As his eyes adjusted to calm him the way he always did when a horse was nervous. It was not a dog. But the moment his hand made contact was too large for a horse's skin, but the bone structure was wrong for a dog. The sound was so forced himself to look more carefully. With pure terror to examine what was in front of him without turning away. Frank stood there in the freezing barn, a large cat, watching this horse that he believed he knew, and it had been dead for any creature on earth. Long enough that there was nothing left but bones. He did not understand what was happening. All his experience, all his knowledge, but something about the sealed horses in the darkness had preserved the odor. He was completely lost. The presence of death. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket near Monarch's stall and waited for the sun to come. Frank looked back at Monarch. He did not leave the barn. And then he looked back at the crate. He could not leave. And then understanding began to dawn on him that was not yet ready to accept that he did not understand all of his experience and all of his knowledge kept him there in the freezing cold. Watching and listening. A horse had known the truth to make sense of something that made no sense at all. A horse had been screaming about death. The screaming stopped around 4 o'clock in the morning. Terrible. Frank had no watch. But he could tell by the way the wind was changing and the way Frank had been too confident that he understood horses to even consider the silence that followed the screaming was something that could not be fixed with medicine or training. When Monarch was screaming, Frank sat down on the cold ground of the barn, real and for the first time in 3 years. The silence made him feel like he was missing something important. Something wet appeared on his weathered face. The horse was still trying to tell him. The tears on Frank's face surprised him more than anything else. The horse paced in his stall, years of living, back and forth. He had built himself into a person who did not cry. Dull thuds. Crying was something that weak people did. Every few minutes, crying was something that would stop and stare at that same corner again. But sitting there on the cold ground of the barn, looking at the skeletal remains of a cat as if he was listening to something that Frank while he lived his life above ground. Then he would shake his head and go back to pacing. Frank could not stop. Frank's joints were screaming by the time. What shocked him most was that he did not try to stop them. Started creeping across the eastern horizon and let them fall. His legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket and began to change in a way that he could not yet understand. His back felt like it had turned to concrete. By the time you finish reading what happened next, you will understand that this moment of weakness was actually the first moment of real strength he forced himself Miller had experienced, holding onto the wooden beam of the barn for support. Frank sat there for a long time. His legs remembered how to work 30 minutes. The morning was coming slow and cold. He did not think about what the ground outside glittered like broken diamonds and the fact that he had been wrong about something. Frank could see his breath inside the barn. He had been wrong about understanding horses, but he was not wrong about understanding the world around him. He was thinking about Monarch. He had been wrong about a lot of things. He was thinking about all the ways he might have. His mind began to work again. Frank approached the horse of his brain. The way he would approach him alive, he did not know. This ranch, Monarch's eyes were still wide, kicked back, and he was still covered. There was a dead animal despite the freezing temperature. Dead animals needed to be dealt with. Frank started his examination. That was something Frank knew how to do. He forced himself to stand thousands of times. His old knees protesting. He ran his hands down. He gathered the horse's legs, heavy gloves, checking for heat, a plastic trash bag, for any sign of injury that would cause this kind of carefully. There was nothing. Someone might move. The legs were cool and normal. The hooves was that was what this had become. There were no cuts or scrapes, a place where death had lived for years without anyone acknowledging it. He moved to carefully remove the bones, feeling carefully for the hardness and tightness that would indicate the way he would want someone to treat his own problems that could happen to him out here on the ranch with no one around. He found nothing wrong. He pulled out his veterinary kit from the shelf bag where he kept it. As he worked, he had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic medical supplies close at hand, still intact. Out here, that had probably hung from any collar. You had to be able to handle emergencies yourself. Someone had loved this cat. He took Monarch's temperature. Someone had thought it was thermometer enough to give it a mouth. The smell was still strong. He checked the horse's heart rate by feeling the pulse in the horse's neck. But he did not stop. Maybe he did not turn elevated. He finished the job completely, animal making sure that every bone was accounted for. Frank looked at Monarch's, that nothing was left behind in the crate except the memory. The horse's breathing there, while still rapid, the remains were collected, was not struggling. Frank by every objective measure that Frank the morning was fully light. Monarch was a healthy. The sun was starting to burn off. The horse was not frost that covered the ground. The horse was not injured. Frank walked to the far side of the property where an old oak tree stood. Frank stepped back and looked at the tree. The tree was massive and ancient. He examined the probably older than Frank himself. Both were clean and fresh. The roots spread out across the ground like the fingers of the straw bedding. Frank chose a spot that might have scared the horse, a place where the ground was soft. He looked at the walls and the roof. He used a shovel to dig a hole. Any sign of damage or leaks that might have let longer than it should have, because his body was tired and his hands were shaking. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked. He placed the bag containing the remains in his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior. Though he was not a religious man and did not really know what words were appropriate, the horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn where a wooden crate was sitting. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner. The crate was old and weathered, Frank said to the empty air above the grave. And split. I'm sorry that you died alone in the dark. Frank had never really paid much attention. I'm sorry that no one was there to help you. It had been on the property when he bought the place 12 years ago. He filled the hole back behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment. Then he stood there for a while, looking at what he had done. Frank walked over to the crate. It was not much. And looked at it more closely. It was a small burial in the dirt under an old tree. It was larger than he remembered that no one cared about. Maybe 4 feet long, but it was something 3 feet tall. It was acknowledgement. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was beginning to understand that the world was larger than his own life. The kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. When he went back inside the house, it could be an infection. Frank did something he had not done in years. Stuck in the horse's throat. He went to the desk in his office. Frank had seen and pulled out the file where he kept his property documents. But as he looked at Monarch several folders before he noticed something strange. The deed to the property. The horse was not just panicking from pain. The paperwork from when he had bought this land 12 years ago. His neck was stretched toward the seller's name was Marcus Thornton, and his entire body read the papers carefully. There was a note at the bottom in handwriting that Frank had not really paid attention to. Frank turned his flashlight. The note said that certain items would remain on the property, and the familiar clutter that had accumulated in that space over the years. Items that Marcus could not saddle leaning against the wall. Frank had signed the papers without a broken water pump that had been sitting there for at least 6 months. It was just the kind of thing that happened. A wooden crate that looked like it had been inherited someone else's junk. Frank reached out to touch Monarch's neck, wondered about Marcus Thornton, trying to calm him the way he always did when the horse was nervous. Had he known what was inside, had the moment his hand made contact with the horse's skin, and then
Monarch
just left it
scream
there
began.
when he moved away.
The sound was
or
so
had something else
terrible
happen
and
entirely.
so filled with pure
Frank found
terror
himself
that Frank
making a
stepped
decision
back away
that
from the
surprised
stall.
him. Frank
was
stood
going to
there
find
in
out
the
the
freezing
truth.
barn.
He was going to
Watching
track
this
down
horse
Marcus
that he believed he
and
knew
ask him
better
directly
than
about
any
this
creature
cat.
on earth.
It was something
And he
the
felt
old
something
Frank
shift
would
inside
never
him.
have done.
He did not
The old
understand
Frank
what was
did not
happening.
care about other
All his
people's
experience,
business.
all
All
his
his Frank
knowledge,
was too
all
busy
his
and too
certainty about
confident in
horses
his own
meant
understanding
nothing in this
to
moment.
waste time on
He was
questions
completely
like this.
lost.
But
Frank
Frank
sat
was
on
not
the
the
same
same wooden
person
bucket
anymore.
near Monarch's
Not
stall
after a night
and
of
waited for the
screaming
sun
and
to
a
come
morning
up.
of tears.
He did not
and
leave
at
the
funeral
barn.
under an
He could
oak
not
tree
leave for an
some
animal
part of him
he had never
the part
met.
that was not
It
yet
took him
ready
2
to
days of
accept that he
searching.
did not
He looked
understand
through old
horses the
ranch
way he
records.
thought he did.
He made phone
Kept him
calls
there
to
in the
people who had
freezing
lived in
cold,
the area longer
watching
than he
and
had.
listening.
He
and trying
searched
to
on the
make sense of
computer that
something
he
that
barely
made no
knew
sense
how
at
to
all.
use.
The
but had
screaming
learned to
stopped
operate
around
out of
4 o'clock
necessity.
in the morning.
Finally,
Frank
he
had
found
a
no
name,
watch,
a phone
but he
number,
could tell by the way
an
the
address
wind was
3
changing
counties over,
and the way the darkness
Frank sat at his
seemed to
desk
be
for a long
loosening its
time
grip
before he
just a little
dialed the
bit.
number.
The silence
His hands
that followed
actually
the
shook
screaming
as he
was
picked up the
almost
phone.
worse than the
What was he
noise
going to
itself.
say?
What
At
right
least
did he have
when
to call a
Monarch was
stranger
screaming
and ask
Frank
about their
felt
dead
like
cat?
he was witnessing
What business
something
was it of
real
his?
and urgent.
But he dialed anyway.
The silence made him
because
feel
something
like
had
he was
shifted
missing
inside
something
him
that
that
night
night.
in the barn.
Something that the horse
Something
was
had broken
still trying
open.
to tell him.
And Frank had
Monarch
learned
did
that
not
sometimes
calm down
breaking
completely.
open was
The
necessary.
horse
if
paced
you
in
wanted
his
to
stall,
let light in.
back and
A
forth,
woman
back
answered
and
on the
forth.
3rd ring.
His hooves
She
making
sounded
dull
younger than
thuds
Frank
against the wooden
expected.
floor.
Maybe in her
Every
40s.
few minutes,
Frank
he would stop
introduced
and stare
himself
at that same
and
corner
explained who
again.
he was.
His ears
He told
would
her
prick
that he had
forward,
just bought a
and his
property
body
from
would
Marcus
go tense,
Thornton,
and
as
he had
if he
found
was
something
listening
that
to
he thought
something
she
that
should know
Frank
about.
could not hear.
There was a long
Then he would
silence
shake
on
his
the
head
other end of the
and go
line.
back to pacing.
Then the woman spoke.
Frank's joints
and
were
her voice
screaming
had
by the
changed.
time the first
It was
hints
quieter
of gray
now,
light
more careful.
started creeping
My father
across the
passed
eastern
away 4
horizon.
years ago.
His
she
legs
said.
had gone numb
But
from
before
sitting
he
on the
died,
bucket for
he
so
mentioned
many
a cat
hours.
that went
His
missing
back
when
felt
he
like
sold
it
the
had
ranch.
turned to concrete.
He always felt
He was
bad about
68 years old.
He always wondered
and he
what
suddenly
happened to
felt
her.
every
Frank
single
closed
one of
his
those
eyes
years
and held the
plus
phone
about
tighter.
20 more.
And then he
He
began
forced
to tell
himself
her a
to
story
stand up,
about a horse
holding
who
onto the
screamed in the
wooden
night,
beam of the
and a
barn
man
for
who
support
finally
while
learned
his
how to
legs
listen.
remembered how to
The
work
woman's
again.
name was
The
Sarah
morning was
Thornton.
coming slow
She
and
listened
cold.
while Frank told
The
her the
frost that
entire
covered the
story.
ground
He told
outside
her about the
glittered
screaming
like broken
horse.
diamonds.
He
in the
told her
early
about
light.
sitting in the barn
Frank could
all
see
night
his breath
in the
inside
freezing
the
cold.
barn now.
He told
The
her
air was
about
that
finding
cold,
the crate, but he
and
was
the
not thinking
skeletal
about the
remains.
cold anymore. He told her
He was
about the
thinking
bell
about
on the cat's
Monarch,
collar,
and he was
and the
thinking
way he
about
had buried
all
the
the ways he
bones
might
under
have
the
missed
old
something
oak tree.
important.
And as
Frank
approached the
spoke,
horse carefully,
he could hear Sarah
the way he would
breathing
approach
on
an
the other end
animal
of the phone.
he did not know,
and he could tell
Monarch's
that something
eyes were
inside
still
her was
wide,
breaking,
and he
open
was
the
still
same
covered
way
in
something
sweat
inside
despite
the
the
freezing
freezing
temperature.
temperature. By the
Frank
time you
started
finish
his
reading this part
examination
of
the
the
way
story,
he had been
you will
trained to do,
understand that
the way
sometimes
he had
the
done
truth about
thousands
the
of
past
times
has to be
before.
hidden for
He
years
ran his
before
hands
it
down
can
each of
finally
the
set a
horse's
person
legs,
free.
checking
When
for
Frank
heat,
finished telling
for
the story,
swelling,
there was
for
a
any
long
sign of
silence.
injury that would cause
Frank
this
thought
kind
maybe
of
Sarah
panic.
had hung up.
There was nothing.
Maybe he had
The
said
legs
something
were cool
wrong,
and normal.
Maybe he should not
The
have
hooves
called her
looked
at all.
healthy and
But then
clean.
he heard her voice.
There were no
and
cuts
it
or
was
scrapes or
her
signs
name
of
was
infection
Autumn. Sarah
anywhere
said
that
quietly.
Frank could find.
The cat was
He
my
moved
cat.
to the horse's
I was
sides,
8 years old when my
feeling
father
carefully
brought her
for the
home.
hardness and
She was the
tightness
most
that would
beautiful
indicate
cat I had
colic.
ever seen.
One of the most
She was
serious
orange
problems
and
that
white,
could happen to
with
a
spots
horse.
that looked like
Again,
little flames.
he found nothing wrong.
I loved her more
Frank
than I
pulled
loved
out his
most
veterinary
people.
kit from
Frank
the shelf
listened.
where he kept
He did
it.
not interrupt.
He had learned long
He did
ago
not
that
try
a
to
good
comfort
rancher
her.
needed to
He
have
just
basic
listened the way
medical
he had learned
supplies
to
close
listen
at
to
hand.
Monarch.
Out
By
here,
paying
far
attention
from
to
any
everything
vet,
the other
you
person
had to
was
be able to
saying.
handle
Sarah
emergencies
continued.
yourself.
When my father
He took Monarch's
decided to sell the
temperature by
ranch,
placing the
everything
thermometer
happened
in the
very
horse's
fast.
mouth. There was a
Normal.
lot of stress.
He checked the horse's
a lot
heart
of moving
rate by
boxes
feeling
and
the
cleaning
cleaning in the
decisions.
horse's neck.
It was during
Maybe
a really
slightly
difficult
elevated,
time for my family.
but that was expected.
suspected
My mother
if
and
the
father
animal
were
had
having
been in
problems.
panic for hours.
There was a lot of
Frank
arguing.
looked at Monarch's
There was a
eyes
lot
more
of tension.
carefully.
And then
pupils
one
looked
day,
normal. Autumn
the
was
horse
just
is
gone.
breathing.
Sarah's
Still
voice
rapping,
cracked a little.
was not struggling.
Frank could picture
By
her on
every
the other
objective
end of the
measure
phone,
that Frank could
and he
use,
suddenly understood
Monarch
something
was a
very
healthy
important.
animal. The
He
horse was
understood
not
that
sick.
this woman had
The
been
horse was
carrying
not
grief
injured.
for a very
Yet something
long
was
time.
clearly very,
Grief that should
very
have
wrong.
healed by now.
Frank stepped back
Grief that
and
should
looked
have
at the
been
stall
resolved.
carefully.
But
He
grief that
examined
had
the
instead
food and
sat
water.
inside
Both
her
were
like a
clean and
stone,
fresh,
like the
nothing
bones of that
unusual
cat
there.
had sat
He looked
inside
at the
that
straw
crate.
bedding.
My
Checking
father
for
told me
anything
that
that
Autumn
might have
must have
scared the
run away,
horse.
Sarah
Nothing.
said.
He
He
looked
said
at the
that cats do
walls
that
and the
sometimes,
roof,
searching
they get
for
scared
any
by
sign
all
of
the
changes
changes
or leaks
and they
that
run
might have
away
let
to
something
find
get
somewhere
into the
safe.
stall.
Everything
Everything
seemed
seemed
perfectly normal.
I was 8 years
That
old.
was when Frank
I wanted
noticed
to believe
something
him.
he had
But as I got
completely
older,
overlooked the
I
night
started to
before.
wonder.
In his
I started
panic
to
and
ask
his
him
shock at
questions
Monarch
about that
behavior,
day,
about
he had
what
not
happened,
really looked at where
about
the horse
whether
was
he had
staring.
looked for her
The
hard
horse's
enough.
eyes were fixed
Frank
on
waited.
the corner of the
He could
barn
sense
where
that there
a
was
wooden
more
crate
to the
was
story.
sitting.
And
The
he was
crate was
learning that
old and
sometimes the
weathered,
most
with
important
boards
thing
that
you
it
could
could
do
do
for
for
another
another
person
person
was
was
to
to
wait
and
Frank
listen.
had never really
My father
paid
said
much
he
attention
didn't
to
remember
it.
exactly
It had been
what
on the
happened,
property
Sarah
when he
continued.
bought the place
He
12
said that
years
he had been
ago,
packing up
left
equipment,
behind by the
and he had been
previous
moving
owner
things
along with
around in the
various
barn.
other pieces of
He thought
equipment
maybe Autumn
and
had
junk.
gotten into the crate
Frank
somehow.
walked over to the
Maybe
crate
he had sealed
and
it
looked at
without
it more
looking.
closely.
Maybe she
in the
was
growing
inside
light
when he
of dawn.
closed it up.
It was larger
wasn't
than he
sure.
remembered.
By the
maybe
time he
4
thought
feet
about
long,
it, the
and
crate
3
was
feet
packed
tall.
onto the truck.
The wood was so
and then it was
old
too late
and weathered that it was
Sarah's
hard to
breathing
tell what it
changed.
was originally made
She was
of.
crying now.
There were dark
Frank
stains
could
on
hear
one
it in the way
corner,
she paused
the kind of
between
stains that you
words,
get when
in the way
something
she
has
had
been
to
sitting
take
in one
breaks to
place
breathe.
for a very long
I blamed
time.
him for that, Sarah said. For years. Decades. I blamed him for not being careful enough. I blamed him for not looking hard enough. I blamed him for being so focused on his own problems with my mother that he didn't pay attention to my cat. Every time I talked to him after that, there was this distance between us. This thing that we could not fix. It could be
felt
colic.
something in his chest.
It could be an
tighten.
infection. He
It
understood
could be
what
that
Sarah
something
was
was stuck
describing.
in the horse's
He
throat.
understood the way
Frank
that
had
a
seen
single
all of
moment
these
of
things
carelessness
before
could
and
create
knew
a
how to
distance
handle them.
between people.
But as he looked
that
at
never
Monarch
fully
more carefully,
closed.
he
No
noticed
matter how
something
many
strange.
years passed. The horse was
I got
not
older,
just
Sarah
panicking
said.
from pain.
I went to college.
Monarch was staring
I
at
moved
something.
away.
His
I
neck
came
was
back and
stretched
visited
toward
the
my
corner
father,
of the barn,
but never for very
and his
long.
entire body
There was
was
always
trembling
this sadness
violently.
when I was around
His
him.
eyes were locked
There was
on something
always
that
this
Frank
reminder
could
that
not
he had
see.
failed to protect
Frank turned
something
his
that mattered to
flashlight
me.
toward that
And my
corner.
father,
He saw
he seemed
nothing
to
but
understand
darkness
what he had
and the
done.
familiar
He never
clutter
tried
that
to
had
make
accumulated
excuses.
in that
He
space
just
over
carried
the
the guilt
years.
with him.
An old
I could see
saddle
it in his
leaning
face
against the
every
wall.
time we talked
Stacks
about
of hay
autumn.
bales.
Sarah
A
paused
broken
again.
water pump
When
that
she
had been
spoke
sitting
again,
there for at
her
least
voice
6
was
months.
quieter.
A
When
wooden
my
crate
father got
that looked
sick,
like it had been
I was
there
not there
forever.
as much as I should
Frank
have
reached
been,
out to
she
touch
said.
Monarch's neck.
He had a heart attack,
trying to calm him
and
the
by
way
the time
he
I got
always
to the
did when
hospital,
a horse was
he was
nervous.
already gone.
But the
And I
moment his
realized
hand
that I
made
had spent
contact with the
35
horse's
years
skin,
being angry
Monarch
at him for
screamed
something
again.
that was an
The
accident.
sound was
An
so
accident that
terrible
happened
and
when
so
he was
filled with
stressed
pure
and
terror
not
that
paying
Frank
attention.
stepped back
An
away
accident
from
that
the
he had
stall.
regretted
Frank
for his
stood there
entire
in the
life.
freezing barn,
And I had
watching
punished
this
him for
horse
that
that he
accident
believed
by
he knew
keeping
better
myself
than
away
any
from him,
creature on
by
earth.
keeping my love
And he
at a
felt
distance,
something shift
by
inside
making
him.
sure he
He did
knew
not
that he had
understand what was
disappointed
happening.
me. All
Frank
his
closed his
experience,
eyes. All
he
his
understood
knowledge,
this too.
all his
He thought about
certainty
his
about
wife,
horses,
about the
meant
way he had
nothing in
stopped
this
talking
moment.
to her in
He
the
was
last
completely
years
lost.
of their marriage.
Frank sat
He
on
thought
an
about
old
how
wooden
he had been
bucket
so
near
focused
Monarch's
on the
stall
ranch
and
and
waited
waited
for
for
the
the
sun
sun
to
to
come
come
that
up.
he had not
He did not
noticed
leave
she
the
was
barn.
unhappy.
He could not
He thought
leave.
about how that
Some
distance
part
had
of him,
eventually
the part
pushed
that
her
was
to leave.
not yet ready to
Thank you for
accept that
finding
he did
her,
not
Sarah
understand
said.
horses
And
the
now
way
her
he thought
voice
he
was
did.
stronger,
Kept him
more
there in
clear.
the freezing cold.
Thank you for taking the
watching
time to
and
bury her
listening
properly
and trying to make
Thank
sense
you
of
for
something that
respecting
made
her,
no
even
sense
though
at
you
all.
never knew her.
The screaming
That means
stopped around
something.
4 o'clock
That means
in the
that
morning.
Autumn's life
Frank had
mattered
no
to someone.
watch,
But he could
Frank
tell
heard
by the way
something
the
to
wind
shift in
was
Sarah's
changing
voice.
and the way the
He heard
darkness
the beginning
seemed to
of
be
peace,
loosening its
the
grip,
beginning
just
of
a
the
little
kind
bit.
of acceptance
The silence
that
that
comes when
followed the
someone
screaming
finally
was
understands
almost
that
worse
the
than the
past
noise
cannot
itself.
be changed.
At
But it
least
can
when
be
Monarch
altered.
was screaming,
I would like to come
Frank
visit the
felt like
ranch,
he was
Sarah
witnessing
said.
something
I would like
real
to see
and
where she
urgent.
is buried.
The
I
silence
would
made
like to
him
see
feel
this
like he
horse
was
who
missing
screamed for
something
her.
important,
And I would like to
something
thank
that the
you in
horse was
person for
still
what you
trying
have
to tell
done.
him.
Frank
Monarch
agreed
did
immediately.
not calm down
He gave her
completely.
directions.
The horse
They
paced
made
in his
plans for
stall,
Sarah to come
back
the
and
following
forth,
Friday.
back and forth.
When they hung up the
his
phone,
hooves making dull
Frank sat in
thuds
his
against
office
the
for a
wooden
long
floor.
time.
Every few
Thinking
minutes,
about how
he would
strange it
stop
was
and
that a
stare
dead
at that
cat
same
buried
corner
in
again.
darkness for
His
12
ears
years
would prick
could
forward,
connect two
and his
complete
body would
strangers.
go tense.
Thinking about
As if
how
he
a
was
horse
listening
had
to something
understood
that
something
something
that
that
humans
humans
had
had
missed entirely.
Then he would shake his head
Thinking about
and
how
go back to
sometimes the
pacing.
most important
Frank's joints were
messages are the
screaming
ones
by the
that take
time
the
the
first
longest
hints
to
of gray
understand.
light
He
started
looked down at his
creeping
weathered
across the
hands,
eastern horizon,
at the calluses
his
that
legs had
told the
gone numb
story
from
of a
sitting on the
lifetime
bucket
of work.
for so many
And
hours.
he realized that for
His back
all
felt
the
like
work
it
he
had
had
turned to
done,
concrete.
for all the
He was
skills he had
68
learned,
years old,
for all the
and he
confidence
suddenly
he had
felt
built up
every
over
single
6
one of those
decades.
years.
There was one
Plus about
skill
20
he had
more.
never learned
He
at
forced
all.
himself to
He had
stand
never
up,
learned how to
holding
really
onto
see
the
the
wooden
people
beam
around
of the
him.
barn for
He had
support,
never learned how
while
to
his
pay
legs
attention to
remembered
their
how to work
needs
again
and their pain.
The morning was
He had
coming
never
slow
learned
and
how to
cold.
listen the way a
The
horse
frost
could
that
listen.
covered the
But
ground
maybe
outside
Frank
glittered
thought,
like
maybe
broken
it was not
diamonds
too
in
late
the
to
early
learn.
light.
Sarah
Frank
Thornton
could see
arrived
his
on a
breath Friday inside the barn in late April. The air was Frank saw her car pull up, but he was not thinking about the cold that led to the ranch. He was thinking about something that he had not, and he was thinking about all the ways he might have missed something important. He felt like Frank approached the horse carefully enough. The way he would approach an animal he did not be what Sarah Monarch's eyes were still wide. But when she stepped out of the car, still covered in Frank understood that she had already made peace with something. Frank started his examination the way he had been trained to do, everything the way he had done thousands of times. By the time you finish reading these, he ran his hands down. You will understand that sometimes a single moment of truth can heal wounds, for any sign of injury that would cause this kind of panic. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply to admit that the hooves looked healthy and that they are willing to do better. There were no cuts or scrapes. Sarah was a woman signs of infection anywhere with dark hair that was just beginning to show to the horse's sides. She had her father's sharp for the hardness and the same bone structure, indicate colic, the same intelligent one of the most serious problems. But there was something in her face that spoke of sadness. Again, he found nothing wrong. Frank pulled out his veterinary kit because he saw it in his own mirror. He had learned long ago that a good rancher needed to have basic medical supplies close at hand. They simply stood for a moment looking at each other. You had to be able to handle emergencies by a cat that had died 12 years ago. He took Monarch's temperature by placing the thermometer in the horse's mouth. Thank you for coming, Frank said. He checked the horse's heart rate by feeling like it had not been used much. Thank
Maybe
you for calling
slightly
me,
elevated,
Sarah replied.
but that was expected.
Thank you
if
for
the
caring
animal
enough
had
to
been
find
in
out
panic
the
for
truth.
hours. They walked
Frank looked
together
at
toward
Monarch's
the barn,
eyes more carefully.
Frank wanted to show
The
Sarah
pupils
where
looked
the
normal.
crate had been.
The horse's
but
breathing,
more importantly,
while still
he
rapid,
wanted her to meet
was not
Monarch.
struggling.
The horse had
Every
become
objective
something
measure
different
that
since
Frank
that
could
night.
use.
Something
Monarch
calmer
was a healthy
and more
animal.
present. The horse
As
was
if he
not
too
sick.
understood that
The
his
horse was not
screaming
injured.
had finally been
Yet something
heard.
was clearly very, very wrong. Frank stepped back and looked at the stall carefully. He examined the food and water. Both were clean and fresh, nothing unusual there. He looked at the straw bedding, checking for anything that might have scared the horse. Nothing. He looked at the walls and the roof, searching for any sign of damage or leaks that might have let something get into the stall. Everything seemed perfectly normal. That was when Frank noticed something he had completely overlooked the night before. In his panic and his shock at Monarch's behavior, he had not really looked at where the horse was staring. The horse's eyes were fixed on the corner of the barn where a wooden crate was sitting. The crate was old and weathered, with boards that had cracked and split over the years. Frank had never really paid much attention to it. It had been on the property when he bought the place 12 years ago, left behind by the previous owner along with various other pieces of equipment and junk. Frank walked over to the crate and looked at it more closely in the growing light of dawn. It was larger than he remembered, maybe 4 feet long and 3 feet tall. The wood was so old and weathered that it was hard to tell what it was originally made of. There were dark stains on one corner, the kind of stains that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time. When they entered the barn, it could be an infection. Lifted his head. It could be that his dark eyes focused on Sarah's throat, and something Frank had seen all of these things. It was not anything that Frank could put into words. But as he looked at Monarch more carefully, it was recognition. He noticed something strange. It was understanding. The horse was not just connection that exists between Monarch creatures who have both been marked by loss. His neck was stretched toward the corner of the barn, toward Monarch's and his entire body was trembling. The horse did not rear or shy away. His eyes were locked on something that Frank could not see. Lowered his head. Frank turned his flashlight out her hand toward that corner and touched his neck. He saw nothing but darkness and the familiar flutter that had accumulated in that space over the years. She whispered to the horse. An old saddle leaning against the wall. Thank you for remembering her when everyone else forgot. A broken water pump that had been sitting there for at least 6 months. Frank did not interrupt. A wooden crate that sometimes the most important moments were the ones where reached out to touch Monarch's neck. After a while, trying to calm him the way he always did and asked to see where Autumn was buried. But the moment his hand made contact with the horse's tree at the far edge of the property, the grave was marked with rocks, and Frank had placed a small wooden cross there. Stepped back away from Sarah knelt down and ran her hands over the rocks. Watching this horse that he believed he knew better than any creature on earth. She was a good cat. And he felt something shift inside him. She did not understand what was happening, and she never complained. All his experience, even when things were scary, all his certainty about horses, she would have liked in this moment. Frank did not know what to say to that. Frank sat on an old wooden bucket as someone a cat would like, and waited for the sun what Sarah was really saying. He did not leave the barn. She was saying that the life the cat had lived mattered. Some part of him. She was saying that not yet ready to accept that he did not understand horses the way he had eventually brought truth, kept him there in the freezing cold, connection, watching and listening, and trying to make sense of something. They sat there under the oak tree until the sun started to move lower. The screaming stopped around 4 o'clock in the morning. Sarah told Frank stories about her childhood with Autumn, but he could tell by the way the wind was changing and the way the darkness about the way the cat would sit in the window just to watch the birds. The silence that followed the screaming was almost worse than the noise. She told him about the guilt she had carried for so long, screaming, about the way that guilt he was witnessing something real and urgent. I was so angry made him feel like he was missing something. But now I understand that he was just a person trying to tell him. He made a mistake. Did not calm down completely, but he did not do it on purpose. The horse paced in his stall. He was dealing with his own problems, back and forth, his own pain. His hooves making dull paying attention the way he should have been paying attention. Every few minutes, Frank listened. He would stop and stare that Sarah was also talking about. His ears would. She was talking about how Frank had not been paying attention to Monarch, as if he was listening to something the horse was trying to communicate. Then he was talking about how sometimes people miss important things because they are screaming by the time the first hints of gray light started creeping across the eastern horizon. They understand how his legs had gone numb from sitting on the bucket for Sarah to leave so many hours. She asked Frank if he would keep her updated it had turned to concrete. She wanted to know how the horse was doing, and he suddenly wanted to know if he continued to be calm and peaceful plus now about that the secret of the crate. He forced himself to stand up. Frank promised that he would write to her. The wooden beam of the barn. He took her address and her phone number. Legs remembered. He walked her to her car. And the morning was coming slowly down the long dirt road. The frost that covered the ground outside and walked back toward the broken diamonds back toward Monarch. Frank toward the work of breath inside the barn kind of person. The air was that cold. The winter that followed but he was not thinking about the cold anymore. Snow fell heavier than it had in years, and he was thinking about all the ways he might have with a bitterness that seemed to carry. Frank approached the horse carefully, but Frank found that he did not mind the cold he did not know.
The cold
Monarch's
made him
eyes
feel
were
alive.
still wide. The cold
And he was
reminded
still
him that
covered
he was
in
still
sweat
here,
despite the
still
freezing
breathing,
temperature.
still
Frank
capable of
started his
change.
examination
Frank
the way
spent
he
more
had been
time in the
trained to
barn
do,
with the horses
the way
that
he had
winter.
done thousands
He did
of
less
times
work
before.
and more watching.
He ran his
He paid
hands
attention
down
to the
each
small
of the horses'
ways that
legs,
the animals
checking for
communicated
heat,
with each other.
for swelling.
He learned their
for any sign
individual
of injury that would
personalities.
cause this kind
He discovered
of
that they were not
there was
just
nothing.
creatures
The
to
legs
be
were
managed
cool
and trained,
normal,
but
the
beings
hooves
with their
healthy
own
and
thoughts
clean.
and feelings.
There were no
and ways
cuts
of
or scrapes
understanding the
or
world.
signs of infection
Monarch became
anywhere
his
that
constant
Frank could
companion.
find.
The
He
horse
moved
seemed
to
to know that
horse's
something
sides,
had shifted
feeling
in Frank,
carefully for the
that the
hardness
rancher
and
had
tightness
finally
that would
learned to
indicate
listen.
colic.
Monarch would
most
greet
serious
Frank
problems
every
that could
morning
have
with
a
a soft
soft
horse.
nicker,
A
Again,
sound that
he
Frank
found
now
nothing
understood was
Frank
conversation.
pulled out his veterinary
Was the horse
kit from the
asking
shelf
how
where he
Frank was
kept it?
doing? He
Was
had
the
learned
horse
long ago that
confirming
a
that
good
Frank
rancher
was still
needed
there,
to have
still
basic
paying
medical
attention?
supplies close
In the
at hand.
spring,
Out
Frank
here,
did something that
far from
surprised
any vet,
everyone who knew
you
him.
had to be able to
He
handle
invited other
emergencies
ranchers
yourself.
to the property to
He took
teach
Monarch's
them about
temperature
something
by
he
placing the
called
thermometer
listening
to
in
your
the
horse's
horse.
mouth. He shared
Normal.
the story of
He
Monarch
checked the horse's
and
heart
heart
rate
night
by feeling
He
the
talked
pulse
about
in
how
the horse's
experience
neck.
and knowledge
Maybe
were not
slightly
the same
elevated,
thing as wisdom,
but that was expected
and how
if
wisdom
the animal
required
had been in
paying
panic for
attention to the
hours.
creatures in
Frank
your
looked
care.
at Monarch's
Even when
eyes
what
more
they were
carefully.
trying to tell you
The
was
pupils looked
uncomfortable
normal.
or
The
difficult
horse's
to hear.
breathing,
People
while
came
still
from
rapid,
3 counties
was not
to listen
struggling.
to Frank
By
Miller
every
teach.
objective measure
And what
that
they heard
Frank
was
had
not
used,
just a story
Monarch
about a
was a
horse
healthy
and a dead
animal.
cat. The horse
What
was
they
not
heard
sick.
was a story
The
about
horse
a
was
man
not
who had
injured.
learned that the
Yet
most
something was
important
clearly
skill
very,
any person
very
could
wrong.
develop was
Frank
the
stepped
ability
back and
to
looked at the
truly
stall
listen to
carefully.
the world around
He
him.
examined the
Frank
food and
never
water.
smiled the same
Both
way
were
again
clean and
after
fresh.
that night in the
Nothing
barn.
unusual there.
But his smile
He looked
became
at the
something
straw
more
bedding,
real.
checking
It
for
became the
anything that
smile
might
of a
have
man
scared
who
the
had been
horse.
broken
Nothing.
and had allowed
He looked
himself
at the
to
walls
be remade.
and the roof.
It became the
Searching
smile
for
of
any
someone
sign
who
of
had
damage
finally
or leaks
understood
that
that
might
being
have let
strong
something get
did
into the
not mean
stall.
never admitting
Everything
you were
seemed
wrong.
perfectly normal.
It meant having the
That was when
courage to
Frank
change
noticed
when you
something
discovered
that
that you had been
completely
living your
overlooked
life
the
in
night
blindness.
before.
In his
Monarch
panic
lived in
and
his shock
more
at
years
Monarch's
on that
behavior.
ranch.
He had
In
not
all that
really
time,
looked at where the
he
horse
never
was
screamed
staring.
again.
The
But
horse's
Frank
eyes
spent
were fixed
every
on the
one of those
corner of
years
the barn
remembering
where a
that
wooden
single
crate
night
was
of
sitting.
terrible noise.
The crate was old
And he
and
spent
weathered,
every day
with
grateful
boards that
that
a
a
horse had
cracked
refused
and
to let him
split over the
remain
years.
ignorant of the
Frank
truth.
had never really
And
paid much
sometimes,
attention to it.
in the early
It
morning
had been
when
on the
Frank
property
walked to the
when he
barn,
bought the place
he would
12
whisper
years
words
ago,
to an animal
left
that had
behind
been
by
dead
the
for
previous
many
owner
years.
along with various
Words of
other
apology,
pieces of equipment,
words of
and junk.
gratitude.
Frank
Frank
walked
walked
over
over
to
to
the
the
crate
crate and
and
looked
looked
at
at
it
it
more
more
closely
closely to learn
in the
what a
growing
simple
light of
horse
dawn.
had known
It was
all
larger
along.
than he remembered.
That when something
Maybe
is
4
wrong
feet
in the
long
world
and 3
when
feet
something
tall.
is suffering
The
in
wood
the
was so
darkness,
old,
the
and
only
weathered
right
that it
thing
was
to
hard to
do
tell
is
what
to
it was
listen,
originally made
to pay
of.
attention.
There were dark
and to do
stains on
whatever
one
you
corner,
can to bring
the
it
kind
into
of
the
stains
light.
that you get when something has been sitting in one place for a very long time.